Hey everyone, it's your boy IV here. This week I'm working on a new series and we're diving into the details of what to expect in all Nightmare dungeons available. In today's video I'll be covering the Nightmare dungeons, specifically in Dry Steppes. Just an FYI, this is not a tier list and my goal here is to provide my honest opinion in hopes that I can help you get a better understanding of what to expect from each of these Nightmare dungeons. In my last video guide on how to get to the endgame contents in 2 weeks, I recommended people not to run Nightmare dungeons. However, as of June 27, the release of patch 1.0.3 states that they've increased the XP gain from killing monsters in Nightmare dungeons, as well as the XP awards for completing these dungeons. Not to mention that after activating your sigils, you can now teleport directly to the entrance of the dungeons by clicking on the dungeon icon on the map, making Nightmare dungeons the best thing to farm in the game. The developer notes also says that they're looking to increase the monsters and elites density to the endgame contents in early Season 1. This week we'll be transitioning into getting a better understanding of all Nightmare dungeons available to better prepare ourselves for the upcoming Season 1. Keep in mind that all my findings were tested as a barbarian in tier 51 to 60 dungeons. If you're using a different class and come across different findings from what I've shown in this video, feel free to drop me a comment below so I can test them out in the near future. I plan on creating a new class every season going forward to do all my testing, and I'm still trying to decide which class I like to go with in Season 1. In today's video, we'll be covering these Nightmare dungeons using a 5-star rating system. Mob density is based on the overall size of the mobs and how compact these groups are within the dungeon. Mob count scales with the size of the map, so a smaller map can have a 5-star rating even though a larger map can have a higher number of mobs. Map size will range from 1 star being the smallest to 5 stars being the largest. Power level rating is based on the time it took to clear every single monsters in the dungeon, as well as completing all objectives, events included. And last but not least, glyph level rating is simply based on the time it took to complete the dungeon. Some of the icons you'll see in the next few slides are shown below. The orange objective icons shows either the turn-in location from pickups or a midpoint event such as activating the 2 pillars, killing a mini, or destroying a structure before going into part 2 of the dungeon. The red highlighted area covers the portion of the map with objectives of slaying all enemies. Starting off on our list is Dark Ravine. This dungeon is packed with demons and cultists. The mob density is below average due to the downtime you'll find running between each group of mobs. For the mob count, I gave this dungeon a 3 out of 5 as the map size is borderline between towards the larger end. Part 1 of the dungeon requires you to collect animus from 5 animus carriers. Be sure to watch out for the fire aura underneath some of the carriers as they'll do an enormous amount of damage to close enemies. Also, these carriers often blink away, casting a thunderbolt that will strike their initial location. When you get to each group of mobs, make sure you keep an eye out for the Mother's Disciples. They can cast a line of fire which will knock you back and does a great deal of damage. Although this dungeon has a decent number of mob counts, the number of elites and structures you have to defeat as well as the time it takes to run around the map can be very time consuming. Not to mention there's a final boss at the end. For these reasons I gave this dungeon a 3 out of 5 as the power leveling rating and 1 out of 5 as the glyph leveling rating. Next we have on the list is Onyx Hold. The dungeon is mainly packed with zombies and ghosts. The mob density is above average, but I decided to give this a 3 out of 5 due to the fact that some of the mobs can wander off in this large sized dungeon. Probably pass for a 4 out of 5 though. For a dungeon this size, you still find enemies at every corner. 5 out of 5 for mob counts. I strongly believe that this is a great place for power leveling despite the fact that there are a number of cages you'll need to get through. However, due to the size of this dungeon, as well as the objectives you'll need to complete, this is definitely not a good dungeon to run for speed leveling your glyphs. Some of the things I recommend for you to watch out for are ghost enemies that has a chance to charge up for a powerful lightning attack that might one-shot you. Guulrahn Slums is a medium-sized dungeon where you always start from the south side of the dungeon and work your way up north. The first part of the dungeon requires you to free 6 prisoners, which can be a very time-consuming thing to do as getting hit will cancel out the animation of freeing those prisoners. Part 2 of the dungeon requires you to defeat a mini-boss to collect the jail key, which will then lead you towards an area where you have to slay all the enemies around before fighting a final boss. You almost guarantee an event in this dungeon, and the map is very easy to navigate, but the mob density as well as the mob count is on the weaker side. I wouldn't recommend anyone to run this dungeon unless it's for a quest or if you simply just want to do it for fun. Guulrahn Canals is one of the smallest dungeons you'll find in Dry Steppes. For a dungeon this size, it's surprising that you don't find many good sized mobs. However, this dungeon is filled with spider holes that will explode, and it will give you a few more spiders to kill. Due to the lack of mob density, it was not very satisfying to complete the first part of this dungeon, which requires you to slay all the enemies around for the first half of the dungeon. The second part of the dungeon requires you to destroy 2 corpse pile, which can be done in just a few minutes. Throughout the dungeon, make sure you watch out for the explosions from killing the bloated corpse fiend as well as spider hosts. Also, remember the spiders will shoot a web that will stun slot you. I gave the power leveling rating a 4 out of 5 because of how fast you can complete this dungeon, as this is probably one of the smallest dungeons on the entire map. Ancient's Lament is a medium-sized dungeon packed with the decent-sized mobs, but traveling between each group can take up some time. Part 1 of the dungeon requires you to return 2 statues to its pedestals, and the location of the statues are always split in opposite direction. Because of that, I recommend not to run this solo. I took a larger sample size of this dungeon in hopes that I'll find a layout that did not split the statue location apart, but unfortunately I don't think that kind of layout exists. Part 2 of this dungeon requires you to destroy 3 structures. Simply run through the second part of the dungeon in a circle and you'll find all 3 structures to complete the dungeon. In this dungeon, I recommend you to always be on high alerts for the following enemies. Vile lunatics, which are squishy demons that can detonate and one-shot you. Make sure you have them on the top of your hit list. Vile shamans can resurrect other fallen demons and they can cast powerful lightning spells, so make sure to take them out next. Throughout the dungeon, you'll also encounter wrathful phantoms, which are ghost enemies that can potentially one-shot you with a charge-up lightning attack. If you see a red lightning spell below your feet, you might want to sidestep out of it. Overall, I gave this dungeon a 3 stars across the board, but for the mob count, it could potentially pass for a 4 stars. On the last of our list, we have Champion's Demise. This is a small-sized dungeon packed with goatmen and spider enemies. For a dungeon this size, I gave it a perfect 5 for both mob count and mob density. Although you do have to backtrack to turn in the stone carvings, finding mobs along the way won't be an issue if you just stick to one side of the route on your way out and the opposite side on your way back to turn in. The monster that you should put on the top of your hit list is the Moon Clan Shaman. They can buff nearby enemies, and when they empower the impalers, those javelins they throw out can pack a punch. Spider hosts will explode before they die, and spiders will shoot a web that stuns lock you. Other than that, this is probably one of the best nightmare dungeons for power leveling due to the mob size and density. As for being a dungeon to speed level your glyphs, it might be better to do it with a few friends. As always, I hope you find this review helpful, and that I was able to provide some useful information regarding these nightmare dungeons in Diablo 4. I wish you all the best and good luck in getting some of those BIS drops along the way. Until next time, iV, we out.